Hello again, and welcome to Chapter 12, Managing Ecosystems with Mrs. Foes. So this is a picture from the IUCN where they are managing an ecosystem. Okay, so in this chapter, we're going to look at ecosystem-based management, and we're going to look at specific ecosystems. You'll also have an additional lecture on fisheries. Then we'll look at some restoration and legislation. Okay. So whenever you're doing management at the ecosystem level, you have three different perspectives that you need to take into account when you're doing your approach. You need to look at the ecological perspective. Make sure you're doing what's right for the abiotic and biotic factors in that ecosystem. Next, the socioeconomic, and this is really important. You need to look at what the stakeholders value. So the people that live there, that own land, that are coming into contact with those species that you're seeing in your ecosystem. You can do a great job with the ecosystem, but if you don't make the people happy, it won't go well. And then you have to make sure you follow the different laws and find funding from your government, institutional perspective. Cool. Now let's look at a few specific ecosystems. We'll start out with forestry and trees. So first, let's look at alive and dead trees. So you might think that if a tree dies, it falls over, you should take it out, clear the way, right? Well, actually, dead trees serve a really important purpose in the ecosystem. Several species use that as a house. It's important for their niche, as well as it'll get broken down, and those carbon parts will be broken down by decomposers and returned to the soil to grow new trees. So if you keep taking the trees out, you're taking out all of the carbon, all of the nutrients. And then patches of trees. So remember back to previous lectures where we talked about how some species only use the middle of a patch. You want to make sure you have as much middle as possible and it's not all edge. And then this figure is really cool. It shows the growth of a forest, so the age, and then the species that use it, as well as the insects that you'll find. So these different age trees house different insects. So it's important if you're cutting down trees to try to leave some of every age so that there's forest for each of those species, right? And then species composition, you'll want to make sure that you help maintain the same ecosystem that was there. You don't want to take out all the oaks or all the maples, right? Cool. So next, let's look at grasslands. So one issue with grasslands is that native grazers used to have these large grazing patterns where there'd be a large amount in a herd, especially when there was large amounts of predators. They would have to do these big herds so that they didn't get eaten, right? They would have better vigilance, and then if somebody did get eaten, if you're in a group of 100, it's less likely to be you than if you're in a group of 5, right? So as we take out the predators, we lose those native grazers' numbers, and they take different patterns when there aren't big predators. So you have to try to establish that, as well as disturbances like fire, to help maintain healthy grasslands. So if you watch the desertification video by Alan Savory, he talked about how we can use livestock in place of grazers, which is possible in some areas, to try to mimic those natural grazing patterns. I highly recommend watching it if you haven't. You also want to make sure you have good keystone species there, right? So this is the prairie dog. We talked about them before. In a lot of the prairie of North America, they are that keystone species. They make burrows. They help give space for other species, as well as are a food item for a lot of predators. And then fisheries, you'll have a guest lecture on this by my husband, Jacob Foes, who is a fisher. He worked in fisheries management for his master's degree. Next, let's look briefly at cultivated ecosystems. And by what I mean by cultivated is we've turned it into land that we cultivate for different food items like agriculture. So that would be the proximate cause that we need food. And so we have to take more land to make it. But the ultimate cause would generally be the increased level of people that we have to feed. So here's an example where you can do less harm by doing a specific type of cultivated ecosystem. So coffee can grow either in the shade or in the sun. And so these are the two types of coffee. One is much better tasting. The shade is more delicious than the one in the sun. So the shade grows in other forests because it can grow on the floor. It doesn't harm the ecosystem. You don't need as many herbicides or fertilizers, whereas the sun grows faster. So the coffee's not very good, but it grows faster. It's mass produced, right? So if we only buy shade coffee, we're doing better for the environment. And another issue is when we do the crop seasonally. So there have been a few changes that have helped. First, the UK changed their spring grain to fall. Migrating birds needed that food to have enough energy to migrate, so it helped them. And then Germany changed how they mowed their fields. So there's a white stork. They're beautiful creatures, but they're mean. And what they do is they mow only one field at a time, and so then there's fields at each level, so the storks can move field to field based on where they're at in their mowing cycle. Other things that you can do is to use careful treatments on crops. In general, things like Roundup, actually their recommended dose is twice what you need. So you really only need to use half to get the same effect. You'd want to decrease soil erosion, like the CREP program that puts out borders of deep-rooted plants to reduce erosion. Integrated pest management, so that's this picture here. So basically for every insect, there is a parasitic wasp that infects it. So if you have a specific insect that's causing you issues and release the right parasitic wasp, it will hurt them. Or you can do different types of larvae that affect those same pests, which is pretty cool. GMOs, that's a topic that we could spend a lot of time on, but basically, people see them as bad, but that's not really the case. Oftentimes they allow us to use less pesticides, which is helpful. The long-term studies are showing so far that there are no long-term issues from using GMOs. They help us feed more people. There's some really good videos on it, like I recommend this video by Kurz Just Scats. I can't say it, but they do really great videos. There's an interesting one on bees, and there's a great one on CRISPR gene editing. So check this out if you have a lot of questions on GMOs. I highly recommend it. Another issue we have is subsidies, where we make it really cheap to grow certain crops over others that might be more damaging to the ecosystem. If you look at any pop or most snacks, children's snacks especially, you'll find that they have corn syrup in them, or like hydrolyzed or modified corn syrup. Because corn is so cheap to produce, they can use that sugar, which is not healthy for our bodies at all, at very low costs in different things that you drink. Okay, and next let's look at built ecosystems. So this is where people have built lots of structures. You might think that cities are really low biodiversity, but actually some species thrive in that environment. So think about the species that you see every day: robins, squirrels, raccoons, and birds of prey. So there is a peregrine falcon in New York City, lots of birds of prey in Kentucky cities. So that's pretty neat. But some issues with cities, one is that they're generally warmer than the land around them, especially with dark streets. Those absorb heat and get really warm and cause the air around them to warm. So it's this warmer microclimate. An interesting rule in Baltimore is that you have to plant half of your trees that you plant have to be oak. Oak are really good for native species. They hold a lot of biodiversity and maintain it. So if you don't know what kind of tree to plant in your yard, I recommend an oak. We have northern red oaks here, pin oaks. There's a few different options if you're interested. Okay. So remember, we've seen this picture before. Now we're going to look at converting those other ecosystems that are built to a previous ecosystem. So when you want to restore an ecosystem, you have to remove the sources of degradation. And we looked at these previously. Remember, it's HIPCO. So, for example, pollution. If you don't remove the source of degradation, you won't have success, right? So if you have air pollution and you plant lots of new plants, if those were susceptible to air pollution before, they will be still, right? So once you've removed that degradation, you can start to restore the biota. And so this is looking at ecosystem structure and function. And with neglect, it goes down. With rehabilitation, it gets better. It has those structures and those functions until it gets back towards the original restoration. Even possibly better. So what you do to restore an ecosystem is called adaptive management. So adaptive management it's approached like an experiment. So you look, you make your goals, you try, and then you have to see how it's going. So you review, you monitor that plan and say, is there a change we should make? That's adaptive. So making a plan and then changing the plan based on how things are going is adaptive management, right? So if you were doing your garden and things started going wrong and you just said, well, this is the way I'm maintaining my garden, let's just see what goes wrong, that would be not adaptive. But if you decided, oh, I'm going to try to add magnolia flowers to reduce pests, that would be an adaptive management. See if those work. And if those work, keep doing it. And if they don't, stop. So you got to have strong goals, strong monitoring, and then you have to analyze and discuss and adapt and learn. That's the big part. You also need to involve those stakeholders. So stakeholders are the people involved. And if you don't have people behind what you're doing, it makes it very difficult. And oftentimes this can be as easy as a discussion, but other times it might be, providing incentives. And I found this to be very true. If I try to do something on my own that I think is a good idea, like a conservation project, it doesn't go well unless I get other people involved and give them a sense of ownership. And not just say, hey, you do this, but say, what do you think we should do? And have them have a voice in that process. So that does mean you have to give up some control when you're working together. But that might be the way to get your best solution. So legislation can be interpreted in multiple ways, but we're going to go a little bit at it here. I'm just going to go very briefly because you'll see this in depth in Chapter 17. So a big legislation for helping species is the Endangered Species Act, where if a species can be considered vulnerable or threatened, you can make different changes based on that. And that is administered by NOAA. Sylvia Earle from the TED Talk was the first female president of NOAA. It's all National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, so it's water, atmosphere, and then the Fish and Wildlife Service. So that'll be more terrestrial, like ground animals and freshwater fish. And so then, if you have a species, you can do a candidate assessments program where they'll say, is this a species that would be endangered and should we protect it? And here you can see previous presidents and how many listings they did per year on average. A great success story is bald eagles. So it used to be that you would never see them and only over very large water. And now they're far more spread out. You've got a lot in Minnesota and Florida and Alaska, and you can go and see them almost in every state pretty easily. So you can see their history. In the 1700s, there's about 400 birds, and then DDT, habitat loss, so that's a pesticide, brought their numbers way down. And then the Migratory Bird Treaty and Bird Protection Act were in place, and so that you can't kill them. And in the 50s, there's only 412 pairs. In 1967, they were declared endangered. We got rid of DDT. And then in 1973, the ESA protected them. And now we have over 100,000 again. Cool. Sites, we'll see this again in other chapters, but that's monitoring trade of species. So if they are endangered, you can't ship them country to country. And that focuses on the IUCN Red List, so the International Union for Conservation of Nature that you've seen with your endangered species. And over 33,000 species. So this is a not great one here. This is the only species where it's failed. The Sphinx macaw has gone extinct in the wild. It's the only one from CITES to have gone extinct since trade, because of trade, since 75. And then you've got the World Wildlife Fund. They're the largest non-governmental organization. 5 million members, over $100 million a year. They'll oftentimes focus on charismatic species like the panda or the elephant, but preserving them helps preserve other species that live there too. Okay. And so like in 2010, they helped with a campaign to reduce tiger overexploitation. That was fairly successful. Great. Have a great day.